Hello, welcome everyone to Advanced Directives, Why You Need It and How to Complete It, our second in our 3 series of webinars for Untangling the Challenges of Aging, Vital Decisions. This is our spring webinar series, and we're so happy you could join us. I want to assure you that if you have any technical difficulties today, or if you have to jump off to get back to work or other life obligations, we're going to be sending you an email in the next day or two with the link to watch the entire program. So rest assured you'll have access to it. I'm so pleased today to have Ryan Collier of Collier Law here with us to join us in this conversation about Oregon's advanced directives. We're also so thankful to our sponsors of this event, Collier Law, our title sponsor, as well as Oregon Oncology Specialist, Salem Health, Coldwell Banker Commercial Real Estate, Mountain West, and Norco Medical. Without them, we couldn't make these educational series available to the public. I'm going to dive in right away and turn this conversation over to Ryan to get us started learning about advanced directives and why they're so important.
Melissa, thank you so much, and really appreciate Willamette Valley Hospice putting on this educational series. I know that we've been a part of, the years that you have been doing this. Just wonderful outreach to the community, spreading the word about not only about hospice, but tools that people can use to make those kind of inevitable life transitions just easier for families to manage. And my wife and I personally are so grateful for Willamette Valley Hospice for all they've done in our lives. Both my wife's mother, Judy, and also my father benefited from hospice and the care of your volunteers and your nurses and the staff. And we're forever in your debt for doing that. My wife, Holly, lost her mother 21 years ago at a time when we had kids in diapers and she needed her mother to help her. And her mother had this disease called bulbar ALS that took her very quickly. And I want to tell this story because it's important for understanding the value of hospice. Judy was a fiery redhead, just this amazing woman, and certainly very, very stubborn because she was Irish, not just because she's Irish, but I suppose that's one of the reasons. But she knew that she had this disease and she didn't want any help. And so my wife, with 3 young kids, was doing her best to care for her mother. And she had heard about hospice and asked Judy if we could bring a hospice nurse in. Of course, she said no and no and no. And finally, we were able to convince her just to meet someone from Willamette Valley Hospice. So this wonderful hospice nurse from Willamette Valley Hospice came to her house and said, "I'm going to go talk to Judy in the back bedroom." And so Holly and I, of course, stayed out in the living room, and we're like looking at each other like, "Oh my gosh, that poor nurse is going to get the what for from Judy. It's not going to go well." And we waited and we waited. And about 30 minutes later, that nurse came out and said, "Okay, Holly, I'll see you on Tuesday. I'll be back." And she left, and our jaw just dropped. Like, we were blown away. And when Judy came out with bulbar ALS, she could not communicate anymore. And so she went up to Holly, and with her little notepad where she'd write notes, she wrote 2 words, "Thank you." And sorry, I'm going to try not to get emotional. But from that moment forward, Willamette Valley Hospice turned that process into a burden and a struggle for my wife. It allowed her to be, instead of a caregiver, to be a daughter again and to enjoy that sacred time that Judy had left, to be in her home, to watch her grandkids play. And so from that moment forward, we are all in on hospice. Holly volunteers for hospice. She's a respite volunteer. We do these educational series. We are trying to promote to the whole community the value of hospice, of supporting families. So thanks, Melissa, and thanks for Willamette Valley Hospice. I just wanted to share that little story. And today is a great opportunity to talk about a tool that everybody needs. Everybody here needs an advanced directive for healthcare. It's a tool that is adopted that does both a medical power of attorney and also a directive on end-of-life care. And with the medical power of attorney, there's so many things that you have to do every day regarding your medical care. What doctors do you want to see? What treatments do you want or not want? What prescriptions do you need? Where do you want to do your rehabilitation? All these things require your authority. And if you can't direct your own care, if for what, even if it's temporary, we need people in our lives to be able to do that. And if we don't have those people in our lives to do that, we get stuck. We have to use other resources. We have to use the court to appoint people to do that. And instead, we have a great tool that provides that. You can assign that ability to direct your care to a healthcare representative, people you trust. Also, it's going to allow you to leave some instructions for when you can't direct your care and when you want life support and when you want tube feeding. We're going to be talking about that in more detail today. But those two key parts were combined into one form. Now, how many of you probably remember the Terry Schiavo case? Remember that case from the late 80s, early 90s? That 27-year-old woman in Florida had a brain hemorrhage that really put her into a permanent vegetative state in a coma. And the medical services were able to use life support to keep her body alive, while her husband and her parents fought a legal battle on two simple questions. One, what would Terry have wanted? Would she want to be on life support for 14 years? And two, who should make that decision? Well, it tore that family apart, went up and down to the U.S. Supreme Court twice, just on those two simple questions. Now, as tragic as that story was, what Terry Schiavo's legacy is it started a conversation all around the country on what tools can we make accessible to everyone to be able to appoint who you want to make decisions and also leave some directions on the life care. Oregon was an early adopter. We were actually one of the first states to have a combined medical power of attorney and directive in one form that people can complete. And every couple of years, our legislature adjusts the form and tinkers with it. So you're getting the most recent version right now. And that's what we're going to be talking to you about today. Now, Terry Schiavo case, of course, was a big deal, but on a more practical level, I also want to tell you why everybody needs this form. If you're 18 years old or 88 years old, you need this in your toolbox because you can't always count on you will have the ability to make your own decisions. I'm going to tell you a story about my son, Jacob. He actually gave me permission to share this story. Jacob is 24 years old right now. And when he was a sophomore at Oregon State University, go Beavs, by the way, he was a residential advisor, an RA, which means that he had his own room and it was in the basement of one of those residence halls. Well, he was studying for finals and did something where he stretched, blacked out, went straight back on that concrete floor and hit his head, woke up about 2 hours later with a bleeding on his skull, pretty serious concussion, and nerve damage, was barely able to dial 911. Ambulance came and picked him up, took him to, is it Good Samaritan or Corvallis? So took him to that emergency room. And then because he's an adult, the hospital would not call me until Jacob regained enough consciousness to be able to call me. So about 10 o'clock at night, I get the call from Jacob saying, Dad, well, I knew something was wrong. I took his advance directive. I put it on my phone, drove down to Corvallis, walked into the emergency room, stood across the desk from that check-in nurse and said, oh my gosh, I need to see my son. Well, she was doing her job when she said, I'm sorry, sir, I can't divulge patient information. So from across the table, I sent her those documents. She opened it up right in front of me, says, oh, Mr. Collier, your son is 2 doors down on the right-hand side. So I was able, because Jacob had that tool in place, I was able to advocate for him, talk to his doctors, make sure he got the MRI, take great notes about his treatment plan, because he was not going to remember a single thing with that concussion. So because he had that tool in place, his family, me, was able to help him through that recovery. Jacob had a full recovery, everything's fine, but that's an example of why everybody needs this tool. Melissa, why don't you show us the tool?
Absolutely. So we're going to dive right into the Oregon Advance Directive. And Ryan and I like to use this workbook from Oregon Health Decisions, which is an Oregon nonprofit that's developed this tool that we're going to talk to you about today. And I do also want to remind you that we will try to get to questions. There's a lot to cover in this workbook and the legal form, and we want to make sure to walk through the legal form so you can do it by yourself at home if you're ready to complete your advanced directive, which hopefully you will be after today's session. However, we will try to get to some questions, so please put those in the question box. There should be a little icon with a question mark up there. And if we, for some reason, don't get to your questions today, you did receive an email this morning with from the email address webinars@wvh.org. You can always send your questions there, and we'll parse them out to whoever is best to answer that question for you. So this is the beginning of the Oregon Advanced Directive workbook from Oregon Health Decisions. One of the reasons Ryan and I really like this workbook is that it has 3 sections. The first section of the workbook is the conversation starter, and it gives scenarios, real life scenarios, just like the Terry Schiavo example that Ryan just gave, and has questions for you to think about to start developing your ideas of what you'd want to have on your advanced directive and the kind of conversations you need to have with your family members so that they're prepared to make the healthcare decisions for you should they ever need to be in that situation. The yellow tip section in the middle is called the individual worksheet. And the reason I like the individual worksheet is because it allows for a little more explanation about your thoughts on different situations, what you would like. The blue part is the actual legal form, and it's only a few pages long. And, you know, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm so happy I have Ryan as a resource here. But for me, the legal form is written like a legal form, right? There's some things that aren't really clear, and that's why we like to walk through it with you all. And it doesn't give a lot of space. I mean, it's better than it used to be, but it doesn't give a lot of space to write out all your thoughts and give a lot of directions like, well, in this scenario, I'd want this, but in this situation, I'd want that. So the individual worksheet, the yellow tip section, lets you do that a little bit more. I want to talk through a couple of these scenarios with you and show you how these pages of the conversation starter work and why they're so important. You'll notice every page has a topic. This one is your views on prolonging life. These little blue boxes here have words that are really important to know and the definitions of those words. And then below, you'll notice there's discussion questions. These are great to talk about with your family members or the people you assign as your healthcare representatives. For example, in this scenario, it's about Don and Judy, who are in their 50s and in good health, but they're ready to get their ducks in a row. They're probably doing their estate planning, doing their advanced directives, and legally documenting their wishes. Well, they feel really differently. One of them says, gosh, I've lived a good long life, and I really wouldn't want to be kept alive by any kind of machine. And the other says, I don't know, they're making new medical discoveries every day. I'd want to be able to take advantage of that if suddenly tomorrow they came out with a cure for the illness that I had. So that's why it's so important that even in a family among a couple, that every person has their own advanced directive, because we all have our personal beliefs and our personal wishes that might be very different even from our partner or spouses. So one of the first questions that's going to be asked in the advanced directive is, who should make decisions for you if you cannot? Ryan was talking about the ability to assign a healthcare representative. That's what we call the healthcare power of attorney in Oregon, is the healthcare representative. So this is someone that's legally able to make decisions for you for your healthcare if you're unable to speak for yourself. In this scenario, it talks about Vera, who recently lost her husband. She's in her late 60s. And she has a health condition, an autoimmune disease. Her daughters live out of state, and she's thinking, so who would make medical decisions for me today if I were taken to the hospital? She's thinking about who would be her healthcare representative. So ultimately, she decides to go with a younger sister who is local, as opposed to her daughters that could take a while to arrive on the scene. And that's something to think about when you think about your healthcare representative. Certainly, someone in another state can be your healthcare representative. They might have to make decisions by phone Would they feel comfortable with that? Or would they be the kind of person that would need to get in person to get the information they wanted to make the best decision for you? And how do you feel about that, knowing that it possibly could delay care? So these are all complicated decisions, partially because we can't always anticipate what's going to happen in our life, right? We don't know what kind of health concerns we may be faced with. In this particular scenario, Sam is young. Well, I think he's young because he's my age. He's 44, and he has a serious illness that's terminal. So how would our decisions change if we found out that we had a condition that was terminal? Is the extent of our life as important as the quality of our life? Some of us, quality of life is much more important than the number of days. Other people, it's the number of days because they're, they have a special event, a wedding, something that they're really looking forward to, that they want to make sure that they do their best to be there for. It's, again, a really personal decision. And not all of us feel really comfortable talking about our own death. So completing your advance directive does bring up those issues that we're not always super excited to talk about at the dinner table. A lot of people are worried about being a burden to their loved ones. And it's important to have these conversations with our loved ones. Sometimes we worry about something that really isn't a worry to our loved ones. And it's really important, as someone who has been a healthcare decision maker for a family member with a terminal illness, that we've had those conversations. It gives a lot of peace of mind to those of us who are making healthcare decisions to know, gosh, I know my dad would be in agreement with this decision, even though he can't make his wishes known right now. There's a lot of peace of mind and comfort in that. Living with dementia also adds its own host of intricacies and difficulties. So this scenario is about Catherine and is so common, resonates so much with me and my grandmother's experience personally, who had Alzheimer's disease also. So her illness had been going along for a long time and her health is good. She doesn't appear to be in pain, although she can't verbalize that any longer. She doesn't recognize her family and is unable to participate in any kind of conversation or decision making. And now in this scenario, she's come down with pneumonia. And oftentimes people with an illness like dementia we know dementia is an incurable illness. And in fact, it's a terminal illness. It's just that it's an illness that may take many years to get to that final stage, that final 6 months that we might think of for hospice care, for example. And in the midst of that illness, oftentimes people have potentially curable illnesses like pneumonia, like urinary tract infections. So families are in the situation of deciding, my loved one has an incurable terminal illness, but she has also an illness that could be cured. Should we treat that illness? Or should we provide palliative care? So the difference between curative care and palliative care. Curative, of course, that's attempting to cure a disease. In this case, it would be the pneumonia. Things like transfusions, chemotherapy, dialysis, antibiotics are all considered curative care. Palliative care is where instead of trying to cure an illness, we focus on the comfort for the illness and we allow the disease to take its natural path. So this could be a situation where someone says, well, gosh, I know my illness is not curable, but if I get a curable illness that's causing me pain, I'd want that pain to be treated, or I'd want that illness to be treated. These are really hard to anticipate situations, but very common. For example, my grandma had urinary tract infections, which is common for people with advanced dementia. We treated those because we know that urinary tract infections cause pain, and we wouldn't want her to be in pain. Later, she had a stroke, and we chose against a feeding tube because we knew she was already nearing the end stages of her dementia. And it seemed that palliative care was the best decision for her at that time. These are decisions that family members struggle with every day. So what would you like in Catherine's circumstances? Again, Ryan mentioned that we would talk about things like feeding tubes and ventilators, whether we want help from machines to help us continue living. In this situation, George is 62 and he's had a lung disease for a long time and has difficulty breathing daily. And one day a friend finds him unconscious. And in fact, George had been without oxygen for enough time that he suffered brain damage and he will not be able to survive without being on a ventilator. So his healthcare decision maker will be in the position of deciding, would he like to live his life on a ventilator in this situation, or would George prefer the ventilator be removed and him to die a natural death from that? So ventilators have sure been in the news over the last year, haven't they? So we probably all are familiar with ventilators at this time because of all the discussions about COVID. But it is important to know that if someone is on a ventilator for a permanent period of time, an extended period of time, usually it involves surgery to place the breathing tube into the windpipe, a tracheostomy, and prevents the person from coughing or clearing secretions. So they need constant care for suctioning. So that may play into someone's decision as well in terms of what they would want in that scenario. Likewise, receiving food and water through a tube is something that the healthcare decision maker may need to decide for you, or you may be in a position to make those decisions. Actually, almost all of us will be in a position to make healthcare decisions for someone else. So that's why I think it's the least we can do to complete our own advance directive. Simone's situation is just almost exactly like Terry Schiavo's. She's in a persistent vegetative state after a car accident. She has brain damage and will really unlikely ever regain consciousness, but she's young and otherwise healthy. So through artificial hydration and artificial nutrition, she could live. Obviously, she would need care that entire time, as we have discussed. So this page kind of talks about what is loss of consciousness. What's the difference between a coma, a persistent vegetative state, and brain death, and artificial hydration and nutrition. So when we don't receive fluids, naturally we die within about 3 to 14 days. And in fact, in hospice care, this is a really common occurrence because the natural processes of our body when we have a terminal illness is to slowly shut down. And one of the things that happens is we no longer are hungry or thirsty. And it's the body's way of just naturally shutting down. In fact, there's quite a big body of evidence to prove that sometimes forcing hydration or nutrition can cause pain to someone that has a terminal illness in the dying process, because our body just sort of knows what to do when it's time to die. So anyway, I think that's just important to note that like in Simone's case, she would need artificial hydration to stay alive. Otherwise, her body would follow that natural dying process. Artificial nutrition is a tube. It could be through the nose, the mouth, or oftentimes surgically placed in the stomach to provide food when someone cannot eat normally. And, you know, Terry Schiavo, it's such she gave a gift to us through her very tragic circumstance that we all know the importance now of making our wishes known, and also about how legally making them known is even more important, because I always say, I don't know what Terry Schiavo would have wanted because she didn't complete an advance directive. But what I know is she probably didn't want her husband and her parents fighting it out in the Supreme Court. I don't think any of us would ever want that. And so having this legal document prevents any question about that. CPR also is important to think about. This is about Roger, who's in his 70s, that had a stroke, and he doesn't really have anyone at home to take care of him. And so he ends up in a care facility where he can get the care he needs 24 hours a day. There's a common situation when you go into a care facility that you may complete a pulse portable orders for life-sustaining treatment. And next week's session, next Thursday, we'll talk a little bit more about PULSE and having these kind of conversations with your family members. So I hope you'll come back for that, our last session, a last webinar in the series here. But one of the things the PULSE is asking is, do you want CPR? So if your heart stops, would you like it restarted or attempted to be restarted? Now, this is, again, a really personal decision. Some people say, I would like a DNR. That's what oftentimes people call the PULSE. I don't want my heartbeat restarted because I know I've lived a good long life and I'd like to be allowed to die a natural death. And this is a tool that can help you make those decisions and help your wishes be known and met if that is your decision. However, you know, everyone is different. And so sometimes a PULSE is created and needs to be changed over years. That's the same with the advanced directive. Your healthcare representative now may not be the same person you'd choose in 10 years. My grandma, for example, is turning 95 next month. My grandfather died about 3.5 years ago. She has been so fortunate to live a good long life. And to her, if her heart stops, she knows that CPR is likely to cause more damage to her body and that she wouldn't be able to come back to her current state of health right now. So she has chosen to complete a PULSE that says do not resuscitate for those reasons. So that's just one example of what folks might choose.
Hey, Melissa, I want to chime in really quick. One question I get from my clients all the time is, what's the difference between a PULSE and an advanced directive? And I want to do my best to explain the difference. The PULSE, which is a portable order for life-sustaining treatment, it's actually signed by your doctor, really directs primarily EMTs on what should be done outside the hospital setting. So that's literally why you take that little pink sheet and stick it on your refrigerator. Because if the ambulance is ever called because you're found on your kitchen floor, for instance, EMTs come, one EMT goes to treat you, and literally the other EMT runs the refrigerator to see if you have a PULSE that's registered. And they make sure, because if your PULSE is a physician's order that says do not resuscitate no matter what, then they actually will right there let you pass. If you check the other box on the PULSE that says please resuscitate, bring me to the hospital, let's figure out what's going on with me, then know that before you get to the hospital, it's the PULSE that controls. But once you get to the hospital and the hospital evaluates you, they may actually put you on life support to figure out what's going on. But once you get to the hospital, that's the point in time when your advanced directive then takes over with your wishes and who should make those decisions. So PULSE is before you get to the hospital, advanced directive is after you get to the hospital. What do you think, Melissa? Is that a good explanation?
I think that's a good way to think about it. I think theoretically you could end up in the hospital, and there's some parts in the PULSE that talk about other forms of treatment like antibiotics or things like that, and they might still use that as a guidance there because, of course, our advanced directive doesn't cover those specifics. I like to think of an advanced directive as something you get when you're 18, like Ryan made his kids do, and that you change and evaluate over your lifetime. And then hopefully at a much later time in your life, you get a serious illness, you become medically frail, or you're just old. And at that point, you talk to your doctor about a PULSE and about the kinds of treatment you would want if 911 had to be called. And that way you hopefully get your wishes met in terms of your healthcare needs. So I think that's a great way to describe it, Ryan, to this really helps those EMTs know what to do when 911 is called and how much to do. We have to skip through some of this part because we just don't have time. But of course, I always like to touch on hospice. I know Ryan talked about it a little bit too, but this is one of those topics that we often don't talk about until someone needs it, until someone gets that diagnosis from a physician that says you are in the last 6 months of your life. But in fact, I think talking about hospice is critical long before that and should be a part of your advanced directive conversations. I myself know I want hospice service, and my poor husband has to hear about it often. So I always say, if something happens to me, who do you call? And do you know who you're supposed to call? Do you know what questions to ask? because I want hospice as soon as I'm eligible. I've seen the difference it's made in my family members and, of course, many of our clients in the community that I've had a chance to talk with. So it's important to talk about your wishes, not just at your death or at the hospital, but even before then, too. And of course, sorry, this is a little bit hard to scroll through. Organ donation would be another thing to talk about with your healthcare representative, your family, and make sure you include either in the worksheets or on your advance directive in the little open spaces. There is a glossary in this workbook. It is really tiny. You have to get your magnifying glass out to read it. But if you forget what does pulse mean again, then this can be a helpful tool on this page of the worksheet. The yellow part of the worksheet, just a reminder, is great for those nuances. You know, there's lots of check boxes in here, grids. What does quality of life mean to you? What would be important to you? We all have different feelings on those items. How do you feel about pain medicine? And what about that situation like Catherine? If I have an incurable illness, which will most probably cause my death, do I want to try medical treatments to prolong my life? Or would I want to try it for a little while? Would I not want to try it at all? Again, super individualized. Also, what if I wanted to try it for a little while? What does that mean? Is that a few days, a few weeks, a few months? A little while could mean different things to different people. So there's a chance to write some of those things, and even some blank spots to write things that are important to you about organ donation, about your healthcare representative, and also this part, if I have a choice, where would I want to die? And maybe any reasons you'd like to put down. And who would you like to have with you? Do you have any preferences about your death? Things like that can be really, really helpful to your family members. I know they can be hard to deal with now, but they're a gift you can leave your family members for later. There's a chance to sign it and date it, and in case you change it later, you could sign and update it. This isn't a legal form, this yellow tipped section, but it's a really helpful thing for your family. We're going to dive into the actual legal form, but before we do, Ryan has a few notes about how he likes to use this tool as well.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. So obviously, well, not obviously, so I'm an estate planning attorney. I have a practice here, Collier Law, where we do exclusively work in the area of estate planning, wills, trusts, help families make those life transitions for probate and administrative processes. And this is a great tool in the toolbox that we build for our clients. And one of the things that I do when I have a new client that's coming in, I know that we're going to fill this advanced directive out together, and it's heady. I mean, you're dealing with death and dying and quality of life. It's pretty challenging form if you've never seen it before. So what I like to do is I actually give my clients as homework this Oregon Health Decisions workbook, and I have them essentially like a book club go through section 1, the discussion questions, the scenarios, so that the individual or the married couple can really get a feel for the kinds of decisions that they're going to need to make, the kind of situations their family might be involved in. That yellow section, I have them go through that to make some decisions on quality of life. What does that mean to them? What would happen during incurable illness? And it's a great resource for a married couple or for families really to get to understand each other's opinions on those topics, because they will be a little bit different. And then when they come to my office, now they're ready to fill out the advanced directive because they've really thought these things through a fair amount. And actually what we'll do is we actually sometimes take the yellow section, if they've filled it out, we take that and attach it as a supplement to their advanced directive because it really flushes out some of these issues really well. So we like to use as the homework before we complete the advanced directive, and then we actually incorporate that into the advanced directive. So that's how we like to use it at our office. So food for thought for anyone here that's getting their affairs in order. This is a great starting place for thinking about some of these issues as you're starting to put these tools together. All right, so let's talk a little about part 3, which is the advanced directive itself. This is the tool created by our Oregon legislature that allows you to appoint representatives and leave some instructions. And there are some instructions right here at the very beginning. You start by incorporating, your own contact information, and then under the new Oregon form, you can pick up to 3 healthcare representatives in order. So there's a first, a second, and a third. You don't have to have 3, but now you have space for 3. Just a few years ago, there was only space for 2, and they expanded it to 3. Now, my experience in this healthcare representative had the hospitals work with them. Under the statute, under the law, your healthcare representative under this medical power of attorney can make any decision you can make while you're healthy about your own medical care. When you can no longer direct your own care, that's the important part. When you can't direct your own care, that's when they're given the authority to do things for you, like make decisions on hiring and firing doctors, like what treatments you do or don't want, like where you should be placed. So those kinds of decisions are incredibly important. Go ahead and scroll down a little bit. So in this first part here, this is one of the sections of the advanced directive that they recently changed. I'm not a huge fan of. It's essentially asking you this question as you're about to start your instructions. You've now appointed your 2 or 3 people, and you're about to leave some instructions. And the first question they're asking you is, do you want your instructions to be mandatory, meaning your representatives must follow your instructions to the letter, or do you want them to be guidelines as your healthcare representatives are making these decisions? Man, I have a real hard time making mandatory what you can't really predict. And the way that Oregon's directive is going to work, as Melissa's going to explain, is they're giving you a few hypothetical situations to make decisions on. But the reality is there's an infinite number of hypothetical situations you might be involved in. So it's challenging if you really restrict the ability of your healthcare representatives to use their brain and help you. I think that's creating more problems. So I tend to counsel people, and this is not necessarily legal advice, it's actually more just practical advice and experience after my 24 years. If you trust these people to make good decisions for you, to talk to the doctors, to invest in good decisions, trust them to make the good decisions. I tend to counsel people to initial the second one on that one too. And then section 4 is the actual directions on end-of-life care. Now there's a part A and a part B, and Melissa and I are both going to talk about this part a little bit. So part A, once again, not a huge fan of the order that they did these in, but it's what we have, so we're going to work with it. Part A, really, just scroll down a little bit more. What part A says is it's like a general instruction or an actual directive that you have to your doctor that says you do not want your life to be prolonged by life support if you're in any of the conditions in part B. Well, how do you even necessarily answer this before you read part B? So the way that I work with my clients on this is I say, all right, let's skip part A. Let's look at part B. Part A is like a bonus question. If you answer part B in the right way, we'll come back to part A and initial that. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Melissa to talk through part B and how she works with those.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. It's sort of one of these situations where they put the cart before the horse on this form. And this is why Ryan and I walk through this with people, right? Because it can be really confusing. What are they talking about part B? Oh, you haven't gotten to it yet. So here we are now at part B. And if you can sort of think of your advanced directive as I kind of think of it as 2 parts. One part that assigns your healthcare representative, and one part that is telling doctors at the hospital what you would want in 4 very specific end-of-life scenarios. That's it. That's all the advanced directive really does. So these are those 4 scenarios we're going to go through. I want to just be clear on one part of it. One of the options here, well, on every question, they're going to ask you if you'd like to receive tube feeding under this scenario, or if you don't want to receive tube feeding, or if you'd like tube feeding as your healthcare provider recommends. Now, a lot of us, if we think of our healthcare provider, I'm picturing my doctor that I go to, right? Every time I need to go to the doctor, that's my healthcare provider. But that's not likely who's going to be interacting with this document. We're talking about a situation at the hospital because all of these scenarios are very close to death scenarios. So just know that it isn't your doctor that you necessarily go see on a regular basis to manage your health care. This is likely someone at the hospital that you may or may not have ever met before. And again, you'll also be asked to make a decision about life support or excluding life support or getting life support only as the healthcare provider recommends in the hospital. And that's so for each of these 4 questions. So let's get down to business. The first question is, if you are close to death, if I am close to death and life support would only postpone the moment of my death, your choices are, I want to receive tube feeding, I want tube feeding as the healthcare provider recommends, or I do not want it. And also, I want life support, I want it as my healthcare provider recommends, I do not want life support. Your second scenario is being permanently unconscious. So think of that Terry Schiavo situation, or Simone in our example in this booklet. If I'm unconscious and it's very unlikely I'll ever become conscious again, you're choosing about tube feeding and life support here. The third scenario is like Catherine with the dementia. If I have a progressive illness that will be fatal and is in an advanced stage, and I am consistently and permanently unable to communicate by any means, swallow food and water safely, care for myself, and recognize my family and other people, and it's very unlikely that my condition will substantially improve. This is really similar to my grandma's situation after she had a stroke. This example is her situation to a T. Would you want tube feeding? Would you want it as the healthcare provider recommends, or would you not want it? And same with life support. The fourth and final question is about extraordinary suffering. And this one I'm always trying to find an example for. So this is if life support would not help my medical condition and would make me suffer permanent and severe pain. I think of something like throat cancer, where being intubated or put on a ventilator might be very painful. A burn victim, perhaps, also. Again, your choice here, tube feeding and life support. And then, Ryan, do you want to talk about the additional instructions here and how to make this legal after you make all those decisions?
Absolutely. So one of the good changes recently to this document is they gave you some options for how to execute it. So there's 2 options now. You can either sign it in front of a notary public. So you can, a lot of professional offices, your financial institution like your bank, your credit union, your financial advisor, they all have notaries on staff. You can make an appointment, go on down there and sign it in front of that notary public. They then attach their seal and that validates your signature. If you don't have access to a notary, people obviously had some challenges during COVID with that. The old way of doing it is simply to have 2 witnesses. Now it's important that your witness not also be one of the people you've appointed as your healthcare representative. So it still can be another family member. It just can't be a physician or a doctor that's treating you, and it also can't be one of the people that you've named, but it would require 2 witnesses that see you sign that document. Now, another question that we get is, Ryan, it's COVID, how do I stay safe and not have to see other people, work with other people? Well, a couple things now. Early in COVID, we were a little more stuck, and so we would do things like garage or parking lot signings, where we actually would come to a client's house, we'd have them open up their garage, we'd lay it out on like the back of their, in one case it was a Ford Falcon convertible, this beautiful red car, and they just laid out a little mat on it. We put the document on there with our masks and our gloves, stepped back, they signed it, they stepped back, our notary stepped forward, notarized it, put the documents in a little folder. We actually quarantined the documents overnight just to make sure they were still okay. That's one way we did it. Now, Oregon has actually adopted a statute allowing remote notaries and electronic notaries. So we have actually sometimes even used remote notaries where they have a video conference with you and they can actually authorize your signature remotely, like like we're having this webinar today. Well, know that, and also you can now make appointments in your in your bank or credit union. So that's how we execute that, and that's how we get signatures and electronic signatures. So the other thing let's talk about is your healthcare representatives, the people that you appoint. Now, once you sign your document, and you do have to sign it before a notary or witnesses, and as soon as you do that, it's a binding document. Now, this other section that authorizes or has signature lines for your healthcare representatives, well, know that it's still binding even without these signatures, but it's a really good idea to have conversations with your healthcare representative so they see your form, so they see the choices you've made, and effectively they agree that they're willing to follow your instructions. So this is where they accept this appointment and agree to serve as your healthcare representatives. So while you don't have to get it for it to be binding, I think it's a great idea for you to present this to each of your healthcare representatives, get their signature that they're willing to serve. That would be important.
I agree, Ryan. I always like to say nobody wants that kind of surprise. Oh, surprise, you're in charge of making these decisions right now while your mom is unconscious at the hospital, right? You like to know that sort of thing ahead of time.
Yeah, and that's a great entree actually into attachments or supplements to the advanced directive. I talked about taking the yellow part 2 of that organ health decisions and attaching it because it provides some good information. We also in the office, after doing this for 24 years, there's just some instructions that are really common among my clients. So I actually put them on 2 pages. We will actually give you a blank version of this so that you can have my additional instructions, but this is what I did. So the common ones that we tend to use are last visitation. And what I do is I have, if a client wants to make this instruction, they'll initial it. If they don't want the instruction, they'll just leave it blank. So things like last visitation. Well, if a family member's on the other side of the country, it might take a couple days for them to come back to say goodbye. And maybe before life support's removed, they really want to say goodbye. So here you're saying, you know what? It's okay to leave me on life support long enough for any family members that want to say goodbye, and that's okay. We also do things like remind your healthcare representatives about hospice. Yes, I want to be on hospice. Authorize me as soon as you can. Doctors aren't always great about prescribing hospice, and you want your healthcare representatives to be your advocate. So we remind them here. We give them extra authority to hire and fire medical providers or move you to a new facility. That's an important authority to have because sometimes if you can't direct your care or say you don't want to be at this particular nursing home, that nursing home may resist moving you somewhere else unless you give them additional authority. Pain control. Well, if you can't direct your own care, you can still feel pain. So we want to make sure that your representative has complete authority to authorize pain medication to relieve or eliminate pain, even if that pain medication might make you less responsive. It might even hasten your death. Morphine tends to speed up the dying process. We just want to make sure we're clear on that instruction. Also, being in your own home. Do you have a preference to be in your own home, surrounded by your loved ones, surrounded by your own things? If that's not too much of a burden on your family or caregivers, and that's that qualifying thing. I also have a lot of clients that are people of faith and have spiritual needs. Well, when you're in a hospital, your family is thinking a little bit more about your physical needs and your medical needs and may not think about the spiritual needs, that you want your pastor or your priest or a chaplain to pray with you and your family, maybe there's certain rituals or things that your faith tradition really requires or needs at the end of life. So this is an opportunity for them to have the name and phone number of who you want them to call in that situation to help. Organ tissue donation. Another thing I want to point out here is feeding. Well, Oregon's Advanced Directive deals well with intravenous nutrition and hydration. Well, that's a tube that goes either through the nose or into your stomach to feed you, but you also have an automatic swallow response. So the risk is you're in a facility, you're in a condition like in Part B where it's no more life support, please, no more tube feeding. Well, we kind of want to expand the definition to include spoon feeding because that facility might feel obligated to keep feeding you and not denying you food and sustenance. We want additional authority to say, hey, if I say no tube feeding, I also mean no spoon feeding. The last one I have here actually is for my Catholic clients. Different faith traditions have different needs around the dying process, and many of my Catholic clients want to follow Vatican protocols on end-of-life care. And so this is a provision that a Catholic lawyer and a Catholic priest helped me put together that follows those end-of-life care protocols, basically avoiding anything that could be considered euthanasia and requiring that they continue to get standard and ordinary measure of care and not the denial of medical care through the end of life. So if you have faith traditions that need to be incorporated, this is a great place to do that. All right, how are we doing on time, Melissa?
Well, I think we should see if we have any questions here.
We actually have 2 questions. And so if you want, do we want to do the questions next, or was there something else that we want to talk about first?
Yeah, well, I think I just would like to make sure I show your information here for anybody that is.
And let's mention this too. So this Oregon Health Decisions workbook is a great resource. And one of the gifts that Willamette Valley Hospice and Collier Law are providing are we are going to give you a link and a code to have a free download of this workbook as a gift from us. So you can download it and complete it yourself. And you'll be getting that as an email after this is over. We also wanted to, so we're going to order online advanced directive. You can see here the link there is Oregon Health Decisions Workbook to order your free copy of the digital download. Once you choose the Oregon's Advanced Directive Workbook, the Oregon Health Decisions Workbook, you click Order Now, Advanced Directive, that you want the digital download, you add it to the cart, and then when you're ready to check out, you enter the promotional code Collier420. That will make that free for you. So you can download that for you and your loved ones. Feel free to share that with family members. And go ahead and flip one more slide.
And
there we go. Also wanted to mention the other attorneys in my office. If anyone has more questions or concerns, either about the advanced directive or any of your other tools, know that we have 4 attorneys in our office, myself, my partner, Stephanie Palmblad, Jonathan Baxel-Massey, that's also our expert in Medicaid planning, and Jacob Sinclair. Any one of us is happy to answer your questions. No obligation. We're just here to help you, partly as a gift for supporting Willamette Valley Hospice. That's important. All right, Melissa, I think at that point, are we ready for questions?
Yeah, let's go ahead and take questions now.
We actually have a couple good ones right now. So Diane asked a question. And go to the published one. Okay, so Diane asks, is the Oregon Advanced Directive document legally binding if you happen to be in another state when the need arises? So great question. So Oregon's Advanced Directive is a form that our legislature created here, but you also live in the United States of America. And I'm going to give you a little constitutional law today. In our Constitution, the United States Constitution, we have a clause that's the full faith and credit clause. And what that means is that the laws of any state must be recognized by all the states. So if you create a document that's legally binding here in Oregon, you could take that advanced directive to any other state and it's binding on that state as well. It could be used by those doctors. Now, there's a practical aspect to this, though, is that those doctors in Arkansas or Florida or wherever you happen to be, they may not have ever seen the Oregon Advanced Directive before. And that might confuse them a little bit, or at least at a minimum require more of their time to figure out. I always recommend if a client moves to another state, that at least when it comes to the directive to physician or the medical power of attorney or the advanced directive, fill out the new form there. They're really readily accessible in all 50 states. Fill out a new one so that the doctors there will recognize it right away. It probably takes them 10 seconds to figure out what your wishes are off that form. And the services will be a little bit easier and quicker to help you. You'll have less obstacles. Is it valid in other states? Yes. Should you still do another form when you get to the new state? Yes.
Ryan, can I pipe in too, just to add that, this is a document, and if I fill it out and then put it in my file cabinet at home, it really doesn't do anybody any good, right? So it's good to think about what we do with our advanced directives after we complete it. Obviously, your healthcare representatives should have copies so that they have it at the ready if they're ever called upon. But you might think about giving a copy to your general physician, your healthcare provider. And in fact, if you live here locally, your local hospital, if you have had any kind of procedure done, lab test, then you have an electronic file, and they can attach your advance directive to your electronic file. Because most likely, you know, if I get hit by a car on the way home, I'm going to be taken to my local hospital here in Salem. So you might just think about anybody else that may need to have your advance directive. If you have an attorney that you haven't had this conversation with yet, and, you know, honestly, I know from Ryan that, you know, good attorneys, if they're doing your estate planning, they should ask you if you need to update your advance directive also. It's just part of the deal.
Absolutely. Okay, now, as a reminder to our attendees here today, at the top of your screen is a little symbol with a question mark in it. If you have some additional questions of either Willamette Valley Hospice or the advance directive itself, please go ahead. This is a great opportunity. We have about 5 more minutes or so for new questions. So let's go ahead and ask the next question. Are you able to complete the Oregon Advance Directive without the assistance of a lawyer and have it legally binding, or does one need to work with a lawyer? Well, I am completely biased, and I'll admit that too. Everybody should work with lawyers. We're the best thing since sliced bread. But to answer your question, one of the reasons that Oregon legislature created this form is to make it really, really easy for everybody to have an advance directive. So we've actually given you the download so that you can download the form yourself, you can complete it yourself, you can execute it in front of a notary or witnesses, and that's a legally binding document without a lawyer. Now, should you talk to a lawyer about filling your toolbox with all the other tools that you need in your planning? Absolutely. Wills and trusts, powers of attorney, all these things are tools that will make it easier for your family to help you when you can't direct your own care, when you can't make your own decisions, or after you pass away. We don't want to be a burden on those people. But as to the advance directive, it's easy for you to do. We've given you the tool to do it yourself. You don't need a lawyer for it to be legal and valid.
So no excuses, right, Ryan?
No excuses.
We've hopefully walked through it with you enough and answered those questions, but as a reminder, if you're like me, you'll think of your question, you know, tomorrow morning in the shower or on your way home from the grocery store or something like that. So if this question comes up to you, that's why we would just recommend you reach out to us via email. You can always call as well, but we're really responsive by that email address that sent your reminder and link for today's workshop. So don't hesitate to reach out to us with questions.
All right, we have another question. I currently have an advance directive in place, but it is several years old. Would it be prudent to have it reviewed and updated? Well, I know how I'll answer that, but Melissa, why don't you answer first?
Yeah, I'm always a fan of saying, yes, look it over. I mean, if things are going smoothly in your life and you haven't had any major life changes, then probably looking over every 2 to 3 years is okay. Just to make sure, gosh, the contact information is correct for your healthcare representatives, that the person you wrote down as your healthcare rep is still the person you want, and that you still feel the same about those questions. Maybe there's some more information you want to write in or attach to it as well. If it's been longer than that, then definitely look it up. And if you've had any life changes, if you've gotten married, gotten divorced, how many times have we heard that, Ryan? People got divorced, they accidentally didn't change their healthcare representative. So if you've had any major life changes, diagnosis of an illness, then it's probably time to take a look at it again, even if it's been less than 2 or 3 years.
And I would also add that our legislature pretty significantly changed the form within the last several years. And even if you picked that form up a year or two ago, you may have picked up the workbook from a prior year when the form looks a little bit different. And after today's workshop, you know a little bit more about how to fill that out. So I think it's a great idea, particularly now that the information is fresh in your mind. I'd go ahead, download it right now, and take your spouse or your loved one, your family member that's going to be your healthcare representative, and complete that workbook together, complete the advance directive together. Now is a great time to do it while you're thinking about it. And then your family's going to have that tool available when something happens. And it's important that we be good stewards of ourselves and that we put the tools together so we're not a burden on the people we leave behind. And those processes, natural processes that we all have to go through in life, we want to make those life transitions as easy as possible as we go through them. So this is a great starting place for that.
Absolutely. Well, we're at the end of our time today, Ryan. I just want to thank you so much for always being such a great resource for our community on this topic. And it's always so fun to work together. And I want to thank our sponsors, of course, Collier Law, our title sponsor, Oregon Oncology Specialist, Salem Health, Coldwell Banker Commercial, and Norco for helping us have this webinar series. Check out next week's, and we appreciate you coming today. And we hope to see you at a future Willamette Valley Hospice event as well. Take care, everyone, and goodbye.